Alright, let's dive into the details now of how photosynthesis works. Brief reminder here, this is our chloroplast, and our two major sets of reactions are light reactions, which happen in the thylakoids, the pigmented part of the chloroplast, and then our Calvin cycle reactions, which happen in the stroma, or the gel between the thylakoids. Pay special attention while you're studying to the chemicals that are shown here. Water, which during the light reactions is converted to oxygen, and carbon dioxide, which in the Calvin cycle reactions is converted to carbohydrates. You might remember from our main chemical reaction that we talked about in the previous video, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and carbohydrates are the primary molecules of the photosynthesis reaction. We're also going to see how the light reactions produce NADPH and ATP to power the Calvin cycle reactions, and that ATP is then converted to ADP, and ADPH is converted to NADP, and we have this cycle going on here of these important intermediate chemicals. Alright, here's our light reaction, and it starts with these bundles of colored molecules, they're pigments, called photosystems. This is photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Might seem really stupid that we called the first photosystem here, we called it photosystem 2, and the second one photosystem 1. Yeah, that is unfortunate. That is the order that they were discovered in, so that's why they're named that way, but not necessarily the order that they work. So because they're pigmented molecules, shown here in green, meaning they've got a lot of chlorophyll, green pigment, they're absorbing solar energy. And they have the ability here with some enzymes that are in this photosystem to absorb that solar energy and use it to energize or heat up some electrons. Where do those electrons come from? They come from splitting water molecules. So this is where water is converted to oxygen gas as a waste product. So water is the source of these electrons that get heated up. That happens in photosystem 2, and we try to visually represent that here with an arrow going up, meaning that these electrons are full of energy. Then this high energy electron goes through an electron transport chain. I bet that sounds familiar. We're going to see a different way to visualize this in a few minutes. That slowly sucks the energy out of this electron, and it uses that energy of this electron losing energy, it captures that energy to make ATP. This ATP is going to be utilized in our Calvin cycle reactions to make carbohydrates. The electron ends up, after it's lost some of its energy at photosystem 1, which can then heat it back up by absorbing more sunlight, more solar energy, and the final landing place for this high energy electron is an electron carrier called NADP+. Might remind you of NAD, an electron carrier that we learned about in the cellular respiration reaction. NADP+, when it takes on this high energy electron into hydrogen, becomes NADPH. So we've now created NADPH, source of an electron that we're going to need, and ATP, source of energy that we're going to need for the next set of reactions. Skipping over some word slides here, which you are more than welcome to read, just trying to focus on diagrams, knowing that you can go back anytime you need to and rewatch the video or pause it and take notes. Go back to your own notes. This is a different way of looking at the same reaction. So just to get our bearings here, this green membrane that we're looking at is the thylakoid membrane. It's green because that's where our photosystems are located. And photosystem 2 here, remember that's the first one in line, absorbs sunlight and heats up electrons. The electrons are coming from splitting water. So I'm not telling you anything you haven't heard already, this is just a different way to look at it. As the electron's heated up, it's passed along a series of enzymes. That's what we call an electron transport chain. And each pass here, each time this electron's passed off from one enzyme to another, the energy is sucked out of it just a little bit. That energy is used to pump hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space. So the thylakoid space has just a ton of hydrogen ions now. Oops. Sorry, there we go. That concentration of hydrogen ions is a bunch of potential energy that can be utilized to make chemical energy. All these hydrogen ions would love to balance themselves out across the membrane by leaving this space. There's only one way for them to leave this space, and that's to leave through this pore called ATP synthase. So this potential energy is converted to kinetic energy as hydrogens flow down their concentration gradient, and then that kinetic energy of these hydrogens moving is converted to chemical energy by the production of ATP. We follow this electron to photosystem 1. Photosystem 1 absorbs light as well, energizes this electron, and then it is passed to NADP along with the hydrogen ion to make NADPH. So if I were you and I was studying for this class and wanted to know what to focus on about the light reactions, I would focus on these photosystems and the role of these electrons as they're being passed along. Where do they come from? They come from water. And what do they do? Ultimately, they provide the energy to make ATP, and they provide the electron to make NADPH. Why do we care about this? Well, ATP and NADPH are what power their Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle is where we're actually going to do the final goal of photosynthesis, which is to make carbohydrate, make sugar. And ATP and NADPH are kind of like the battery power to do that. As we've talked about before, the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma. It's got 3 primary steps here. Really, I don't need you to memorize the details here, especially of some of the chemistry here. I want you to focus on carbon dioxide fixation, because the carbon that's going to ultimately make all the carbohydrates here is floating around in the atmosphere as a gas. So it needs to be fixed, meaning it needs to be grabbed from the atmosphere and turned into a chemical that could become sugar. That's really what the Calvin cycle is. Okay, up here, top of this circle are carbon dioxide molecules. They need to be fixed or captured or glued together to ultimately make sugar. And the Calvin cycle is the way that happens. So here we see our 3 carbon dioxide molecules. Each one contains 1 carbon. Each of those is being used to be grabbed from the atmosphere, stuck on to an organic molecule here. I don't want you to memorize the name of these organic molecules, but maybe you remember from previous lectures, each of these black circles represents a carbon in this carbon molecule. So we're starting off with a 5 carbon molecule here. We're ending up with a 6 carbon molecule every time a carbon dioxide is pulled from the air. Those molecules then can be stripped down into 3 carbon molecules. Okay, I'm following it in the cycle here. We're reducing these carbon molecules, and we're coming up ultimately with a chemical called G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. That is probably the only one of these molecules that I want you to be able to recognize the name of, because G3P is our molecule that's going to help us make glucose and pretty much all organic molecules on the planet. The other thing I want to point out about this reaction is it requires ATP, lots of it, and it requires NADPH, lots of it. Well, gee, where did we make this ATP, this NADPH? Oh, and there's a little more ATP even needed here. Where did we make that? We made that in the light reactions. So that's why the light reactions and the Calvin cycle are both together considered photosynthesis, even though the Calvin cycle happens to be the part where we're actually making the sugar. Also, it's called a cycle, just to complete this idea of this being a cyclical reaction. It's called a cycle because we're starting with carbon dioxide here. We're ending with these 3 carbon molecules called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. But in the process of doing all of this, we are basically ending up right back where we started. We start with these 5 carbon molecules here. By the time we're done with all of the chemistry here, we're right back to what we started with. But we have made glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate by fixing carbon, by grabbing it from the atmosphere. G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, is important because that is the molecule that can be used to make glucose, or it could be used to make amino acids or fatty acids. Basically, all of the organic chemistry in the planet starts with just plant's ability to make G3P, and then G3P can ultimately become glucose phosphate, which can be converted to cellulose in the cell wall, or starch for energy, or sugar for like sucrose in these grapes. That is the final molecule that is made at the end of the Calvin cycle, and then is used to make everything else that the plant needs. What we have just talked about is the type of photosynthesis that's called C3 photosynthesis. It's called C3 photosynthesis because the first molecules where carbon is fixed are 3 carbon molecules. C3 plants that do this kind of photosynthesis, are some of the more dominant ones on the planet. They do very well in cooler and moist environments. We can note that there are some plants, like corn for example is called a C4 plant. There are some plants that are better growing in drier climates. So in order for them to survive the drier climates of, say, a desert, or in the case of corn, the Great Plains of the United States, where it gets pretty hot and pretty dry, they make an intermediate molecule called a C4 molecule, a 4-carbon molecule. They make that in a group of cells, the mesophyll cells, and then pass it on to a group of cells that's finishing the Calvin cycle. So they actually kind of separate the Calvin cycle into 2 cells. The reason that they do that, we can see probably better in this diagram, is it allows them to conserve water. Up here at the top diagram here, this is a C3 plant. Here's the stoma, the pore. When the stoma is open, carbon dioxide can enter, photosynthesis can happen, but the downside is water's lost when these pores are open. So not a big deal if you're in a moist environment, but if you're in a dry environment, like these C4 plants really are designed to be in, opening your stoma comes at a risk. The risk is that, yes, you can get carbon dioxide, but you're not going to be able to conserve water very well. So you can see that these C4 plants actually surround their main photosynthetic cells with a layer of mesophyll cells that do the primary carbon fixation step, and then pass those carbon molecules to an inner group, which is prevented from losing water. The extreme examples, like for example cactuses and plants that live in really desert conditions, are called CAM photosynthesis plants. They do a slightly different form of photosynthesis where they actually do the carbon fixation step only at night. So they only open their pores at night, and then during the day they finish the rest of the photosynthetic process. So they do the ultimate water conservation.